Well, this is a small amount of troops. It's meant to help shore up the security of our NATO partners. All three countries where the troops are going are NATO members. But it's mostly meant to send a message to Russia that we're watching, that we care about the situation in Ukraine, that we're doing the opposite of what he wants now. He wanted us to have less troops and a less of a military presence in Eastern Europe. But his actions on the eastern border of Ukraine have resulted in us putting more troops in. And the more further warning is that if he continues on this path, we're going to put more troops in Eastern European countries and provide more support to our NATO partners, but also more support to Ukraine.
You know, the 3,000 troops being deployed certainly is a small number, to your point at the beginning there. But this is in addition to 8,500 U.S. troops essentially being put on high alert last week. How do we get from kind of these standby orders to deployment so quickly, especially after the Biden administration last week really did try to tamp down any concerns about potential deployments?
Well, it's because the Biden administration and our European countries are waking up to the reality that they have not done enough yet to deter Putin from taking action in Ukraine. All signals, according to the US government, and as I understand, according to intelligence reports, suggest that Russia very well may mount a massive military offensive against eastern Ukraine. So these are efforts to try and deter that from happening. And the Biden administration has calculated that sanctions are important, especially if we get our European partners on board with sanctions. But even sanctions are probably not enough to cause Putin to worry. And that's why we also have to bolster and beef up our military support for NATO members.
Russia, of course, still showing essentially no sign of de-escalation on the border of Ukraine. Could this kind of deployment now further put Russia on the offense, since it really is the opposite of what it was asking for? How do you expect, Putin to respond here?
I don't think this will cause Putin to invade if he weren't otherwise intending to do so. I think, if anything, this will cause Putin to have second thoughts, that he understands if, 3,000 troops have gone into these NATO countries, it means the U.S. is willing to deploy troops to the theater and could even deploy troops even closer to Russia if it feels that we need to do that for our security and for the NATO countries' security. He's also watching closely what the U.S. and Europe are doing in terms of support for the Ukrainian military. Notably, there are some U.S. special forces inside Ukraine that have been doing training, and that could also possibly increase. We may not hear a lot about that, but that's certainly something that's on the table for the Biden administration. All of those things should make Russia worry that the costs of going into Ukraine could be more significant than whatever benefits he thinks he gets from doing it.
The U.S. has, at least for now, consistently said that it will not deploy troops to Ukraine in the event of conflict there. What might the Pentagon do if Russia does choose to actually invade its neighboring country? And what concessions will Biden make it, and at what cost?
Well, if Ukraine does launch a massive military offensive in eastern Ukraine, and I say a massive military offensive because remember, they're already involved in eastern Ukraine. They've already been supporting the separatists in eastern Ukraine. But if they launch a more significant invasion of that territory, I would expect that immediately the Biden administration will issue new sanctions that are very tough, that will go to the heart of Russia's economy, the petroleum and defense sectors in particular. They'll also go towards the banking sector in Russia. They may, in fact, cut all Russian banks off from the international banking system, which would have a significant impact on Russia's economy. You'll also see the Biden administration making sure that Europe is with us and that the EU and the UK also issue sanctions. So that will be the first response, and I expect that will happen immediately. And then there will be that additional support for Ukraine, while at the same time I expect the U.S. would continue to engage in diplomacy. So those are the things that I think the Biden administration is going to do immediately if this invasion happens.
Speaking of diplomacy, then, what are the chances, how realistic is it, to you, that Russia will back down and not for kind of a diplomatic solution here after kind of these escalating tensions?
I don't think anyone knows what Putin is going to do. And I actually think that Putin probably has not even yet decided. He's testing what might work and what he might be able to get away with. So I think the calculus that Putin has is not finished yet. And the U.S., therefore, does have the ability still to affect that calculus through diplomacy. The problem is what Russia wants, which is for the U.S. to assure Russia that we will not allow any other countries to enter NATO, and the other NATO members will not allow any other countries to enter NATO, is not something that NATO is willing to agree to or the U.S. is willing to agree to. And they shouldn't agree to that. Russia has no business dictating to NATO what its membership terms should be. Because the two sides cannot agree on that, it's hard to imagine what other compromises there are. But I'm sure the U.S. is working hard to try to find other areas where Russia would feel that it had gotten some concessions short of this promise about NATO membership.
This is a story we will continue to watch, certainly because of the geopolitical implications, the economic kind of rebounds or ripples that come out of it. Before I have to let you go here, I want to get your take on a story that's developing this morning. U.S. military forces killing a leader of ISIS in a raid in northwest Syria. What's your immediate reaction to this move?
Just a reminder that ISIS is still a threat in Syria and in Iraq. There are still ISIS cells in both countries. We saw a couple weeks ago that ISIS launched a massive attack on a prison that was holding ISIS fighters. Ultimately, the Kurdish forces in Syria were able to put that down, and they were able to crush the ISIS attackers and ensure that not many ISIS fighters were released. But both of these things are a reminder that ISIS still has objectives that it is trying to accomplish. It wants to still establish a caliphate. It wants to engage in terrorist activities against the West and against Western partners and those who are working with the West. And so we have to be very mindful of that and always be secure that we are doing the things we need to do in order to degrade ISIS. We never want to return to 2014 when ISIS held massive amounts of territory in Iraq and in Syria, had a caliphate, and engaged in some of the worst human rights atrocities that we've seen in 100 years.
David, such great insight. Really appreciated. David Tafuri, former Obama campaign foreign policy advisor and former State Department official. All right, let's get you caught up on some other headlines.